When most people think about a Viking funeral, they imagine the body of a deceased warrior floating off across the water in a flaming longboat. But there is no actual archaeological or historical proof that this type of funeral ever happened. Like most civilisations, the Vikings had a strong belief regarding death and the afterlife. So how did they honour their dead? Let's travel back in time now to the Viking Age, where with the help of archaeological remains found throughout Europe and a few remaining written accounts, we can take a look at some of their funeral traditions. Welcome to the Viking Vault. The burning ship myth. The trope of burning funeral boats originates from Norse mythology. A book thought to be the work of Snorri Sturluson describes the funeral of Balder, the son of the Norse god Odin, and his wife, the goddess Frigg, as an extravagant affair. They turned his ship into a pyre, and as Balder's body was carried on board, his wife was so overcome with grief that she died and was placed next to him, along with his horse, the horse's harness, and Odin's gold ring Draupnir. The ship was set ablaze, and Thor held his hammer over the flames to consecrate them. The burning boat was pushed out to sea by a giantess, and the mourners watched as it floated away and disappeared over the horizon. Except for the Old English epic poem Beowulf and other literary texts, there is no evidence that any Viking funerals involved burning boats on the water. However, some of the elements from these stories have similarities to Viking graves, such as pyres, burial goods, and sacrifices. A Traveller's Tale. In the 10th century, the Abbasid Caliph al-Muqtadir sent Ahmed ibn Fadlan on a diplomatic mission from Baghdad to the land of the Volga Bulgars, in what is now European Russia. Fadlan, an expert in Islamic law, wrote about 30 pages of what he discovered on his travels. He was able to observe some Viking death rites that included an elaborate funeral and the celebrations that went with it. He wrote, quote, "I was told that when their chieftains die, the least they do is to cremate them. I was very keen to verify this when I learned of the death of one of their great men. They placed him in his grave and erected a canopy over it for 10 days until they had finished making and sewing his funeral garments. In the case of a poor man, they build a small boat, place him inside, and burn it. In the case of a rich man, they gather together his possessions and divide them into 3, 1/3 for his family, 1/3 to use for his funeral garments, and 1/3 with which they purchase alcohol which they drink on the day when his slave girl kills herself and is cremated together with her master. They are addicted to alcohol, which they drink night and day. Sometimes one of them dies with the cup still in his hand." As was the custom, the chieftain's family asked his slave boys and slave girls, quote, "Who among you will die with him?" One girl volunteered, and as preparations were made for the dead man, the girl would drink and would sing merrily. On the day of the cremation, Fadlan was surprised to discover that the dead man's ship had been beached and hauled on top of scaffolding. He tells us that on the day when he and the slave girl were to be burned, the mourners advanced going to and fro, uttering words which Fadlan did not understand, while he was still in his grave and had not been exhumed. They then produced a couch and placed it on the ship, covering it with quilts, Byzantine silk brocade, and cushions. He tells us that then a crone arrived, whom they called the Angel of Death, and she spread on the couch the coverings. She is responsible for having the dead man sewn up and putting him in order, and it is she who kills the slave girls. Fadlan goes on to say that he saw her himself, quote, "a gloomy, corpulent woman, neither young nor old." He carries on by telling us, quote, "When they came to the chieftain's grave, they removed the soil from the wood, and then removed the wood, exhuming him in the clothes in which he had died. I could see that he had turned black because of the coldness of the ground. They had also placed alcohol, fruit, and a stringed instrument beside him in the grave, all of which they took out. Surprisingly, he had not begun to stink, and only his colour had deteriorated. They clothed him in trousers, leggings, boots, and a silk kaftan with golden buttons, and placed a silk hat with sable on his head. They carried him inside the pavilion on the ship and laid him to rest on the quilt, propping him with cushions. Then they brought alcohol, fruit, and herbs and placed them beside him. Next, they brought bread, meat, and onions, which they cast in front of him, a dog, which they cut in two and which they threw onto the ship, and all of his weaponry, which they placed beside him. They then brought 2 mounts, made them gallop until they began to sweat, cut them up into pieces, and threw the flesh onto the ship. They next fetched 2 cows, which they also cut up into pieces and threw on board, and a cock and a hen which they slaughtered and cast onto it. Human sacrifice. Ibn Fadlan continued his report, saying that the slave girl who wished to be killed was coming and going, entering one pavilion after another. The owner of the pavilion would have intercourse with her and say to her, "Tell your master that I have done this purely out of love for you." The slave girl took off her jewelry and gave it to the angel of death. Then she drank alcohol and chanted before being dragged into the pavilion. The men banged their shields so other slave girls couldn't hear her screams, which might have made them later not volunteer to die with their masters. He tells us that 6 men had sex with the slave girl. Then they and the angel crone killed her with, quote, dire violence. A blaze of glory. Fadlan continued to describe how, quote, the deceased next of kin approached and took hold of a piece of wood and set fire to it. He walked backwards with the back of his neck to the ship, his face to the people with the lighted piece of wood in one hand, and the other hand on his anus, being completely naked. He ignited the wood that had been set up under the ship after they had placed the slave girl whom they had killed beside her master. Then the people came forward with sticks and firewood. Each one carried a stick, the end of which he had set fire to, and which he threw on top of the wood. The wood caught fire, and then the ship, the pavilion, the man, the slave girl, and all it contained. A dreadful wind arose, and the flames leapt higher and blazed fiercely. Finally, Fadlan describes how, quote, one of the Vikings stood beside me, and I heard him speaking to my interpreter. I quizzed him about what he had said, and he replied, "He said you Arabs are a foolish lot." So I said, "Why is that?" And he replied, "Because you purposely take those who are dearest to you and whom you hold in highest esteem, and throw them under the earth, where they are eaten by the earth, by vermin and by worms, whereas we burn them in the fire there and then, so that they enter paradise immediately." Then he laughed loud and long. I quizzed him about that, and he said, "Because of the love which my lord feels for him, he has sent the wind to take him away within an hour." Actually, it took scarcely an hour for the ship, the firewood, the slave girl, and her master to be burnt to a fine ash. We should keep in mind that the death rites described by Ibn Fadlan were for a chieftain and took place among important warriors and leaders. Likely, the common people of Viking society, such as the hunters, farmers, bakers, and artisans, did not participate in such an elaborate funeral practice. It's also important to note that this was just one community of Vikings in an age that spanned over 260 years. There's no way to know how many other Viking groups carried out extraordinary celebrations similar to those described by Fadlan. The women in the Mound. In northern Europe in the early 20th century, a large burial mound was discovered at Oseberg Farm near the city of Tonsberg in Norway. The mound was 44 meters and 2.5 meters high, although it is possible that it was originally over double that height, and it contained a well-preserved Viking ship dating from the 9th century. The vessel is a carve, a small type of longship with a broad hull. Measuring just over 21 meters long and 5 meters broad, the bow and stern are highly decorated with complex wood carvings. The Oseberg ship was not just a burial chamber, it could have sailed. In the middle of the ship was a wooden tent draped with a magnificent woven tapestry. Within the tent, on a bed made from large downfilled quilts, were the remains of 2 women. The ship had been pulled ashore and used for the burial of these 2 ladies. The one, aged around 80 years, was clothed in a fine red woolen dress with an expensive lozenge twill pattern and a white linen veil. The other woman, who was much younger, probably around 50, wore a plain blue wool dress and a wool veil. The relationship between the 2 women is not known, as there was insufficient DNA recovered. However, if we refer to the writings of Ibn Fadlan, it is possible that the younger woman could have been a slave sacrificed to the older one, who was obviously a notable woman, perhaps even a queen. The skeletal remains of 15 horses, 6 dogs, and 2 oxen were also on board the grave ship, probably sacrificed to accompany the 2 women on their journey, as well as a huge quantity of other burial goods. They included 3 ornate sleighs, luxurious textiles, personal items such as clothes, shoes, combs, and beauty creams, along with farm equipment, kitchen tools, and extra beds, all to help the deceased on their spiritual journey and ensure that these important women had a seamless transition into the afterlife. Love and respect. At the other end of the spectrum in Heysham, England, in one of the rock-cut tombs, the 10th century skeleton of a female was found with just an antler comb, and several males were found with swords and knives. In Cumbria, again in England, a female grave contained 2 oval brooches and some sewing needles, among other things. Some Vikings were cremated, others mound buried, and others ground berries, but what is clear is that some rituals appear to have remained constant throughout. The draping of the body in new clothes, the ceremony featuring songs, food and alcohol, and tributes in the form of grave gifts do crop up in archaeological and written evidence time and time again. One theme that runs through many Viking funerals is the use of burial ships to honour the dead. It's not surprising when we consider that they were seafaring people. Viking funerals were seen as a time to express respect and love for the deceased, and the afterlife for them was a place where they could continue what they had done on Earth. Thank you so much for watching this episode of the Viking Vault. Please do subscribe if you're enjoying these videos, and I'll see you next week for another one. Until then, have an awesome week. Cheers!